It was just a family portrait, until historians discovered the truth about the child. The photograph arrived at the Massachusetts Historical Society in a worn leather portfolio, donated by the estate of Elizabeth Hartwell, a retired schoolteacher from Boston who had passed away at 93. Among dozens of family documents, this particular image stood out. A formal portrait from 1889, sepia-toned and remarkably well preserved, showing a wealthy family posed in their grand parlor. Dr. Rachel Montgomery, a historian specializing in post-Civil War America, carefully lifted the photograph from its protective sleeve. The image showed a prosperous family, a stern-faced father in a dark suit with a watch chain gleaming across his vest, a mother in an elaborate dress with leg-of-mutton sleeves, and two older children, a teenage boy and girl, standing rigidly beside their parents. The room behind them spoke of wealth. Ornate wallpaper, heavy draperies, and expensive furniture gleamed in the photographer's flash powder light. Rachel had examined hundreds of portraits from this era, but something about this one caught her attention. In the background, slightly out of focus, two small figures sat on an expensive Persian rug. She leaned closer, squinting at the details. Two girls, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, appeared to be playing with wooden toys. One wore her blonde hair in elaborate ringlets. The other had dark, tightly coiled hair. "Interesting," Rachel murmured, reaching for her magnifying glass. Two children playing in the background during a formal portrait. That's unusual. Her colleague, James Chen, looked up from a stack of documents. "What have you got?" "A family portrait. Late 1880s, maybe 1890, but there are children in the background who aren't part of the formal composition." James walked over, adjusting his glasses. The photographer probably didn't have time to remove them before taking the shot. Film was expensive back then. They might not have wanted to waste another plate. Rachel nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the two small figures. Both girls wore identical dresses, expensive-looking garments with lace collars and ribbon details. It was remarkable, really. In an era when class distinctions were marked so clearly by clothing, seeing two children dressed so similarly was noteworthy, especially considering one child was white and the other black. "Look at these dresses," Rachel said, pointing. "They're identical. Same fabric, same lace trim, same ribbons. In 1889, that's extraordinary. Wealthy families didn't typically dress black children, servants or otherwise, in clothing that matched their own children." James leaned in closer. "Maybe she was adopted? Or a ward of the family?" "Maybe," Rachel said, though doubt colored her voice. But formal adoption of black children by wealthy white families was virtually unheard of in this era, and wards were usually kept at a distance, not dressed identically to biological children. She continued examining the photograph, noting every detail. The blonde girl held a wooden horse, her face bright with a genuine smile. The black girl reached toward building blocks scattered on the rug, her expression harder to read in the slightly blurred background. "I'm going to scan this at high resolution," Rachel said, carrying the photograph toward the Society's imaging equipment. "There's something about those children in the background, something worth examining more closely." 3 days later, Rachel sat in her cramped office, the high-resolution scan of the 1889 portrait displayed across 2 monitors. She had been examining every inch of the image, documenting details for the Society's archive. The formal subjects, identified through the portfolio's documentation as the Richmond family of Boston, had been thoroughly cataloged. Jonathan Richmond, a shipping magnate, his wife, Caroline, their children, Thomas and Catherine, but the 2 girls in the background had no names attached. Rachel zoomed in on the children, enhancing the image with careful adjustments to contrast and sharpness. The blonde girl, clearly a Richmond daughter given her features and the documentation suggesting 3 children, smiled as she held a wooden horse. The other child, the black girl, reached toward a collection of building blocks scattered on the rug. Then Rachel saw it. Her hand froze on the mouse. She leaned forward, her face inches from the screen, and zoomed in further on the black child's hands. There, barely visible in the enhanced image, were marks. Not the casual scrapes and bruises of childhood play, but something else entirely. Circular impressions around the wrists, dark bands of discoloration that formed perfect rings, as if something had been wrapped tightly around the small wrists for extended periods. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She zoomed out slightly, then moved to the child's legs. Where the dress had shifted during play, one ankle was visible. The same marks, circular impressions, darker than the surrounding skin, suggesting repeated restraint. Rachel had seen marks like these before, in photographs of formerly enslaved people, in medical documentation from the era, and the haunting images that abolitionist societies had circulated to expose the horrors of bondage. These were restraint marks, the kind left by shackles or chains worn over time. But that was impossible. Slavery had been abolished in 1865. The 13th Amendment had made it illegal throughout the United States. This photograph was dated 1889, 24 years after emancipation. No child in Boston, in a wealthy household, could possibly be enslaved in 1889. Unless? Rachel's mind raced through possibilities. Stories she'd heard in graduate school whispered accounts of clandestine servitude that had continued long after the Civil War. Children held in conditions that were slavery in everything but name, existing outside official records, invisible to census takers and authorities. She grabbed her phone and called James. "I need you to come to my office, right now." "What's wrong? You sound..." The Richmond portrait. The child in the background. James, I think we found something terrible. Within 20 minutes, James stood beside her desk, staring at the enhanced images on the screen. His face had gone pale. Those are restraint marks, he said quietly. Rachel, those are definitely restraint marks. I know, but that's impossible. This is Boston. 1889, 24 years after. I know, Rachel repeated. But look at them. Look at those marks and tell me what else they could be. James couldn't. Neither could Rachel. The evidence was undeniable, horrifying, and demanded investigation. Within an hour, 3 members of the Historical Society's research team crowded into Rachel's office, staring at the enhanced image on her monitors. The marks on the child's wrists and ankle were undeniable once you knew to look for them. Circular impressions that spoke of metal cuffs, of restraint, of bondage that should have been impossible in post-Civil War Massachusetts. Dr. Patricia Williams, the Society's director, removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. She was a woman in her 60s who had spent her entire career studying American history, but the image before her challenged everything she thought she knew about the post-emancipation North. Are we absolutely certain these aren't shadows? Image artifacts from the scanning process? Her voice carried hope that someone would offer a reasonable alternative explanation. Rachel shook her head. I've checked multiple times with different enhancement techniques. I've consulted with a forensic photographer who works with the police department. These are physical marks on the child's skin, consistent with prolonged restraint. And look here. She zoomed in on another section of the image, showing the child's neck partially visible above her lace collar. There's bruising here as well, faint but present. It's partially concealed by the collar, but you can see the discoloration. James leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. If this is what we think it is, we're looking at evidence of illegal slavery continuing in Boston, nearly a quarter century after the 13th Amendment, in one of the wealthiest, most prominent households in the city. We need to identify this child, Patricia said firmly, her voice steady despite the gravity of the discovery. And we need to understand what was happening in the Richmond household. This isn't just historical curiosity. This is evidence of a crime, a profound injustice. Rachel, I want you to lead this investigation. Pull whatever resources you need, full access to our archives, research budget, consultation with experts. This matters. Over the next week, Rachel immersed herself in research. The Richmond family had been prominent in Boston society. Jonathan Richmond's shipping company had made him a fortune in the decades after the Civil War, transporting cotton, tobacco, and manufactured goods between northern and southern ports. Society pages from the 1880s showed the family attending galas, hosting elaborate parties, donating to charitable causes. They appeared to be pillars of the community, but public records revealed little about the family's private life, and nothing about the black child in the photograph. Rachel started with census records. The 1890 census had been largely destroyed in a fire, a frustrating gap in historical documentation, but she found the Richmond household in the 1880 census. Jonathan and Caroline Richmond, their 3 children, Thomas, born 1872, Catherine, born 1875, and Margaret, born 1882, 3 children. The census listed 3 children, which matched the photograph, 2 older teenagers standing with their parents, and the blonde girl in the background. Margaret Richmond, 7 years old in 1889, but there was no record of any other child in the household. No servants listed, no extended family members, no wards or adopted children. According to official records, the black child in the photograph didn't exist at all. Rachel leaned back in her chair, staring at the census notation on her computer screen. The child was invisible, present in the photograph, but absent from all official documentation. Who were you? Rachel whispered to the image on her screen. And what happened to you in that house? Rachel's investigation took her deep into the archives of Boston's historical records. If the black child wasn't listed in the census, she might be found in other documents, employment records, household accounts, church registries, school enrollments. But each search came up empty, as if the child had never existed outside that single photograph. Then, Rachel discovered something unexpected in the Massachusetts State Archives, a private letter collection from a woman named Helen Bradford, a contemporary of Caroline Richmond, who had moved in the same social circles. The letters, donated decades ago and barely cataloged, sat in acid-free boxes in a climate-controlled vault. Most were mundane, discussions of fashion, gossip about mutual acquaintances, complaints about servants. But in a letter dated March 1888, Helen wrote to her sister in New York, Caroline Richmond continues to host the most elegant afternoon teas, though I must say her household management seems peculiar. She has that little colored girl always about, dressed as fine as her own Margaret, and the 2 inseparable as twins. Little Margaret adores her, calls her her dearest friend. Some whisper about the arrangement, but Caroline insists the child is an orphan she's taken in as a charitable gesture. Still, I've never seen a charity case dressed in imported French lace and silk ribbons. The girl never speaks at gatherings, just stands near Margaret like a shadow. There's something unsettling about it all. Rachel's hands trembled as she photographed the letter with her phone. This confirmed the child's existence and her unusual status in the household. The identical clothing wasn't accidental, it was deliberate, part of whatever arrangement the Richmonds had made. But Taken in as charity didn't explain the marks on her wrists and ankles. Charitable wards weren't chained at night. She continued through the correspondence, finding more references scattered across months of letters. Helen Bradford had been observant, noting details that others might have missed. Another letter, from June 1889, just before the photograph would have been taken. I attended Caroline's garden party yesterday. Little Margaret and that colored girl were playing together on the lawn, and I noticed the colored child wore long sleeves despite the heat. When I mentioned it to Caroline, she became quite sharp with me, saying the child had sensitive skin. But Martha Aldrich told me later she'd seen bruises on the child's arms when her sleeves rode up. What kind of charity is this? And then, a letter from November 1889, months after the portrait. The Richmond household is shrouded in whispers. That little colored girl has vanished, and Caroline claims she's been sent to relatives in the South. But Mary Blackwood swears she heard terrible crying from the upper floors late one night, and when she asked the household staff about it the next day, they wouldn't meet her eyes. The staff have been sworn to some kind of secrecy. Jonathan Richmond has become positively tyrannical about his privacy, refusing all social calls. Margaret is devastated. She cries constantly for her lost friend. The child had disappeared, vanished from the household with no explanation beyond a flimsy story about relatives in the South. Rachel made notes furiously, her handwriting barely legible in her haste. The timeline was becoming clearer. The portrait taken in 1889, showing two girls dressed identically, playing together as friends. Then, shortly after, the black child disappears under mysterious circumstances. The marks on her body suggested prolonged restraint. But why? What had this child endured? And what had ultimately happened to her? Rachel's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While researching Jonathan Richmond's business operations, she discovered that his shipping company had maintained meticulous records of all cargo and passengers, detailed manifests that documented every voyage, every transaction, every person who traveled on Richmond vessels. These records, considered historically significant for understanding post-war commerce, had been donated to the Maritime Museum in Salem decades earlier. She drove north on a cold February morning, the highways still dusted with snow from the previous night's storm. Bare trees lined the route, their branches dark against a gray sky that threatened more precipitation. The Maritime Museum was housed in a converted warehouse overlooking the harbor, and the archivist, an elderly man named Peter Donnelly, greeted her warmly when she arrived, stamping snow from her boots in the entrance. "The Richmond Shipping Company records," he said, leading her through rows of filing cabinets and storage boxes. "Fascinating collection. Richmond ran a tight operation, documented everything down to the last penny. Most shipping companies of that era kept bare-bones records, but Richmond was obsessive about documentation. What are you looking for specifically?" "Passenger manifests from the late 1880s, particularly any voyages to or from southern ports, Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans." Peter pulled several archive boxes from the shelves, each carefully labeled with dates and routes. Richmond did regular trade with all those cities. Cotton and tobacco coming north, manufactured goods and textiles going south. Here, 1887, 1888, and 1889. These should have what you need. Rachel settled at a research table, pulling on cotton gloves to protect the aged documents. She began carefully examining the manifests, page after page of careful handwriting documenting the mundane details of commerce, ship after ship, voyage after voyage. Most passengers were businessmen, traveling for trade negotiations, families relocating between cities, the occasional European immigrant continuing south after arriving in Boston. Then, in a manifest dated July 12, 1887, she found it. Her breath stopped. She read the entry 3 times to be certain she wasn't misinterpreting the faded ink. SS Marianne, Charleston to Boston. Cargo, cotton, tobacco, naval stores. Passengers, Mr. Jonathan Richmond, returning. Mr. Charles Whitmore, merchant. Mrs. Adelaide Foster and 2 children, relocation. Also transported. Child, Negro female, approximately 5 years of age, traveling in care of Mr. Jonathan Richmond, no name recorded. Declared as domestic servant. Rachel's hands shook as she photographed the document. A 5-year-old child, transported from Charleston to Boston as a domestic servant. No name, just child, Negro female. The bureaucratic language made the horror clinical, almost mundane. She checked the other manifests with renewed urgency, searching for any mention of a return voyage. Month after month she searched, until finally, in a manifest dated August 23, 1889, she found the second entry. SS Marianne, Boston to Charleston. Cargo, textiles, machinery, manufactured goods. Passengers, Mrs. Caroline Richmond, business travel. Mr. Thomas Blackwood, merchant. Also transported. Child, Negro female, approximately 7 years of age, traveling in care of Mrs. Caroline Richmond. No name recorded. Declared as returning to family. The dates aligned perfectly. The child had been brought north in July 1887 at age 5. The photograph was taken in 1889 when she would have been 7. And in August 1889, just weeks or months after the portrait, she was transported back to Charleston. "Returning to family," Rachel whispered bitterly, staring at the words. But nothing in Helen Bradford's letters suggested the Richmonds had maintained contact with any family in the South. The explanation felt like a lie, bureaucratic language concealing something darker. Rachel's investigation shifted south. If the child had been brought from Charleston and returned there, someone in that city might have records. Or at the very least, memories passed down through generations about families whose children had been taken north under false pretenses. She contacted Dr. Marcus Freeman, a historian at the College of Charleston who specialized in African American life in the post-Reconstruction South. When she explained what she'd found, the photograph, the restraint marks, the shipping manifests with no names recorded, his response was immediate and grave. "What you're describing sounds like clandestine servitude," Marcus said over a video call, his face filling Rachel's laptop screen. He was a man in his 50s with gray threading through his hair, and his expression showed both professional interest and personal pain. After the Civil War, there were cases, more than most people realize, of wealthy families continuing to hold black children in conditions of bondage. The practice had different names: apprenticeships, wardship, charitable care. But the reality was slavery by another name. "But how could this happen in Boston?" Rachel asked, frustration and disbelief coloring her voice. 24 years after emancipation? In one of the most progressive cities in the North? Marcus's expression was weary, as if he'd answered this question many times before. Because the children had no legal documentation, no birth certificates, no parents with the resources to advocate for them, no legal standing to challenge their situation. In the chaos of Reconstruction, thousands of black children were essentially orphaned, their parents dead, displaced, or too poor to care for them. Families were told their children would have opportunities in the North: education, good food, safety. Once transported, these children had no way to prove their free status, no way to contact their families, no way to leave. They were invisible in official records, not listed in census data, not enrolled in schools, existing in a legal gray area that allowed their exploitation to continue. Marcus promised to search Charleston archives for any records related to the Richmond family or missing children from 1887. 3 days later, he called Rachel back, his voice tight with emotion. "I found something. In the Charleston Police Department records from July 1887, a black family named Wallace reported their daughter missing. She was 5 years old. The report was filed on July 9th, just 3 days before your shipping manifest showing Richmond transporting a 5-year-old black girl from Charleston to Boston." Rachel's breath caught. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. "What was her name?" "Sarah. Sarah Wallace." The police report states she was last seen near the docks in the early morning. The family insisted she had been taken, that a well-dressed white man had approached them, made promises about work and education in the North. The mother, Clara Wallace, told police she'd refused, but the next morning Sarah was gone. The detective's notes... Marcus paused, anger evident in his voice. The detective's notes suggest he didn't take the complaint seriously. He wrote that the child probably wandered off, or that the family was trying to cause trouble. The case was closed within a week. Sarah. After weeks of investigation, the child in the photograph finally had a name. She wasn't just an unnamed victim, a statistic, a footnote in history. She was Sarah Wallace, taken from her family at 5 years old. "The Wallace family," Rachel said urgently, leaning toward her computer screen. "Are there any descendants? Anyone still in Charleston who might remember family stories?" Marcus hesitated. "I found death certificates for the parents. Clara died in 1892, just 3 years after Sarah was returned to Charleston, if she was indeed returned. The father, Samuel, died in 1896, but there was a notation in Clara's obituary. She was survived by a son, Samuel Wallace, named after his father. I'm trying to trace his descendants now. Give me a few more days." 2 weeks later, Rachel stood on the doorstep of a modest home in Charleston, South Carolina, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The house was small, but meticulously maintained, with flower boxes under the windows and a fresh coat of blue paint on the shutters. Dr. Marcus Freeman stood beside her, having offered to make the introduction. Grace Robinson answered the door, an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes sharp and clear. She was 87 years old and the great-granddaughter of Samuel Wallace, Sarah's older brother. "Dr. Freeman said you found something about my family," Grace said, ushering them into a living room filled with photographs and mementos. "Something about a child who was taken." Rachel sat on the edge of a floral sofa, suddenly uncertain how to begin. How do you tell someone that you found evidence of their ancestors' suffering? How do you give someone a name and a face, but no happy ending? "My grandmother told me stories," Grace said softly, settling into an armchair across from them. Her voice carried the weight of generations, of stories passed down mother to daughter across decades, about the sister who was taken. The family never stopped looking for her, never stopped grieving. "My grandmother said her father, Samuel, my great-grandfather, spent years trying to find his sister. He never forgot her." Grace brought out a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside were photographs, letters, and a handwritten journal, Samuel Wallace's diary, passed down through this family as a sacred trust. Rachel's hands trembled as she accepted the journal. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. She opened it carefully, finding entries in careful, sometimes uncertain handwriting, the writing of someone who had taught himself to read and write. July 15th, 1887. Sarah is gone. Mama says a white man in fine clothes took her from near the docks this morning. He told them he would give her work up north, give her a better life, schooling. Said she would send money back to help the family. Papa tried to fight, said Sarah was too young to go, but the man laughed at him. Said we should be grateful someone wanted to help. Police won't listen to us. They say Sarah probably just wandered off, that we're making trouble. August 3rd, 1887. Still no word about Sarah. Mama cries every night. She sleeps in Sarah's bed holding her doll. I pray she's safe wherever she is. I pray the man was telling the truth about school and good treatment. But Papa says the man's eyes were cold. Papa says he's seen men with eyes like that before. December 25th, 1887. Christmas without Sarah. Mama made her favorite cake, sweet potato with molasses, but we couldn't eat it. We saved a piece on her plate like she might come home and want it. Where is she? Does she remember us? Does she know we're looking for her? The entries continued, year after year. Samuel Wallace had never stopped wondering about his sister, never stopped hoping she would return, never stopped noting the dates that had meant something to their family. Then, in September 1889, a letter came today. No return address, just a Boston postmark. Inside was a photograph. Mama screamed when she saw it. It's Sarah. She's alive. She's dressed in fine clothes like a rich white child, playing with toys on an expensive rug. There's a white girl beside her, and they're dressed exactly the same. But Mama says something's wrong with Sarah's eyes. She says Sarah looks scared, even though she's playing. She says our Sarah would never have that look in her eyes unless something was very wrong. We tried to find where the photograph came from, who sent it, but there's no way to trace it. Who sent this to us? Was it Sarah? Did someone help her? Why didn't they send her home instead? Someone in the Richmond household sent them the portrait, Rachel whispered, looking up at Grace. Someone who wanted your family to know Sarah was alive. Grace nodded slowly, tears streaming down her weathered face. My grandmother said Samuel kept that photograph until the day he died. He would sit and look at it for hours, trying to understand what had happened to his sister, trying to see if she was truly safe, or if that look in her eyes meant she needed help. He couldn't give. Back in Boston, armed with Sarah Wallace's name and story, Rachel pursued a new line of investigation. If someone in the Richmond household had sent that photograph to the Wallace family in Charleston, there might be other evidence of dissent among the servants, people who had witnessed what was happening to Sarah and had been troubled by it. She found employment records in the Massachusetts State Archives. Every household employing more than 3 servants was required to file basic documentation with the state: names, wages, length of employment. The Richmond household had employed 5 people in 1889, a cook named Mrs. Elizabeth Brennan, a housekeeper named Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, 2 maids named Mary O'Brien and Ann Sullivan, and a groundskeeper named Thomas Murphy. Rachel began the painstaking work of tracking down descendants of these servants. Most trails had gone cold. The working class of the 1880s left fewer records than their wealthy employers, their lives documented in fragments and gaps. Mrs. Brennan's line ended with her death in 1901, childless. Mrs. Hayes had married and moved west, her trail disappearing in California. Ann Sullivan had died young of influenza. But Mary O'Brien had married, had children, and her descendants still lived in the Boston area. Rachel located Thomas O'Brien, her great-grandson, who lived in Dorchester and worked as a high school history teacher. When Rachel called and explained her research, Thomas's response was immediate. My great-grandmother worked for a family named Richmond. She never spoke much about it, but she left some letters. My mother kept them. Come by tomorrow. I'd like to know what really happened in that house. The next evening, Rachel sat at Thomas's dining room table, while he brought out a cardboard box filled with family papers. My great-grandmother came from Ireland in 1887, he explained. She was only 17. The Richmond family hired her almost immediately. She was thrilled to have such a good position with a wealthy family. But she only stayed 2 years. She never explained why she left, but my grandmother said Mary would never talk about her time in that house. Said some things were too sad to speak about. The letters were addressed to Mary's sister back in Ireland, Bridget, who had remained in County Cork. They had been returned to Mary after Bridget's death and preserved in the family. In a letter dated May 1889, Mary wrote, Dear Bridget, there's wickedness in this house, though it hides behind fine manners and charity donations. They keep that poor-colored child locked in the nursery at night. I've seen the chains on her bed frame, heard them rattle when I bring up breakfast trays. Mrs. Richmond pretends it's for the child's own good, says little Sarah wanders at night and might hurt herself, but I know cruelty when I see it. I grew up seeing enough of it in Ireland. The child cries for her mama at night. Little Margaret, the youngest Richmond daughter, begs them to let Sarah sleep in her room instead. Says Sarah is frightened alone, but Mr. Richmond won't allow it. He says it's important Sarah learns her place. What place? She's a child, no different than Margaret, except for her skin. Rachel's eyes burned with tears as she read. Sarah. Mary O'Brien had known her name, had heard her crying at night, had witnessed her suffering. Another letter from July 1889. The colored child is being sent away. They say she's going back to her family in the South, but I don't believe it. I helped pack her trunk yesterday, and there was nothing in it but rags, old worn clothes, nothing like the fine dresses she wore when company visited. Where are those dresses? Why would they send her away in rags if she was truly going home to family? I asked Mrs. Richmond about it, and was told to mind my business or find employment elsewhere. Something terrible is happening. With Mary O'Brien's testimony and the Wallace family records, Rachel had assembled the pieces of Sarah Wallace's story. She presented her findings to the Massachusetts Historical Society Board in a conference room filled with board members, journalists, and descendants of both the Richmond and Wallace families. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on her shoulders as she stood at the front of the room. In July 1887, Jonathan Richmond traveled to Charleston on business, Rachel began, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the story. Behind her, a projector displayed the enhanced photograph, Sarah's face visible in heartbreaking detail. While there, he encountered the Wallace family near the docks where they lived and worked. He offered to take their 5-year-old daughter, Sarah, north to Boston. He promised employment, education, and a better life, promises that desperate families in the post-Reconstruction South heard often and sometimes believed. She clicked to the next slide, showing the shipping manifest. But Sarah wasn't taken for charitable reasons. The Richmonds' youngest daughter, Margaret, who was also 5 at the time, needed a companion, someone close to her age who could play with her, keep her entertained, be a constant presence in her childhood. The Richmonds could have hired a nursemaid or governess, but instead they wanted something different. They wanted a child who would be completely dependent on them, completely under their control. The enhanced image of Sarah's wrists appeared on the screen, the restraint marks clearly visible. A gasp rippled through the audience. Sarah was dressed in expensive clothing when company visited, creating the appearance of benevolence and charity. The identical dresses were meant to suggest equality, even friendship. Margaret Richmond genuinely cared for Sarah. The letters make that clear. But at night, Sarah was chained to her bed to prevent escape. She was beaten when she disobeyed. She was told her family had abandoned her, that she had nowhere else to go. Rachel's voice grew harder. This was slavery in everything but name. Sarah had no legal documentation, no proof of her free status. She couldn't leave, couldn't contact her family, couldn't appeal to authorities. She existed outside the official record, invisible to census takers, invisible to everyone except the people in this household who either participated in her abuse or witnessed it helplessly. Patricia Williams, the society's director, stood. Her face was pale but composed. Dr. Montgomery, what happened to Sarah after she was returned to Charleston in August 1889? Rachel's expression darkened. This was the part she dreaded most, the question with no satisfying answer. We don't know. The shipping manifest confirms she was transported south, supposedly returning to family, but there's no evidence she ever made it back to the Wallace family. Samuel Wallace's journal makes no mention of her return. There's no death certificate in Charleston, no marriage record, no census listing. After August 1889, Sarah Wallace simply vanishes from all historical records. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of a life stolen and erased. It's possible, Rachel continued carefully, that she was sold or transferred to another family in the South. Children held in clandestine servitude were sometimes moved from place to place to prevent them from establishing connections or finding help. It's also possible she didn't survive the journey south or died shortly after arriving. The conditions on ships for black passengers, even children, were often brutal. We may never know what happened to Sarah Wallace after she left Boston. Grace Robinson, seated in the front row, spoke up, her voice breaking. But we know she existed. We know her name. We know she suffered. That's more than we had before. My family has been looking for Sarah for over a century. Finally, we can put a face to the stories. Finally, we know she was real and loved and missed. 6 months after Rachel's initial discovery, the Massachusetts Historical Society opened a new exhibition, Invisible Children, Clandestine Servitude in Post-Civil War America. The exhibition hall had been transformed, its walls covered with photographs, documents, and testimonies that told stories of children like Sarah, black children held in bondage long after slavery's official end, their lives hidden behind the respectability of wealthy households. At the exhibition center, mounted behind protective glass and dramatically lit, hung the 1889 Richmond family portrait. But the display had been carefully designed to shift focus away from the formal subjects and toward the children in the background. Sarah Wallace's face had been enlarged, enhanced, made impossible to ignore. Beside the photograph, a placard told her story in detail. Her abduction from Charleston, her years in the Richmond household, the restraint marks on her wrists and ankles, her mysterious disappearance. Grace Robinson traveled from Charleston for the opening, accompanied by 15 members of the Wallace family, descendants of Samuel who had gathered to honor their lost ancestor. Grace was now 88, moving slowly but with determination. She stood before the photograph, with tears streaming down her face, seeing her great-great-aunt for the first time, not as a ghost of family legend, but as a real child, captured in a moment that should have been innocent play, but instead documented ongoing suffering. She was beautiful, Grace whispered, touching the glass protecting the portrait with trembling fingers. Look at her face. Even with everything they did to her, she was still a child, still playing, still hoping. She was brave, braver than any of us can imagine. To survive what she survived, to keep going day after day, that took courage we can't comprehend. The exhibition didn't just tell Sarah's story. Rachel's investigation had opened a floodgate of research across the country. Historians began examining family photographs from the 1870s through the 1890s with new eyes, looking for other invisible children. Black children present in wealthy households with no official documentation, no names in census records, no trace in history except their faces captured accidentally or deliberately in family portraits. They found dozens within months, then hundreds. Each photograph revealed another child stolen from their family, another life lived in bondage long after slavery was supposedly abolished, another name that had been forgotten until someone looked closely enough to see the truth hidden in plain sight. The Boston Globe ran a front-page story, Hidden Slavery, how wealthy families continued to enslave children decades after the Civil War. National news outlets picked up the investigation. Descendants of other Wallace family members contacted the Historical Society from across the country, sharing stories that had been passed down through generations. Stories of children who never came home, of families torn apart by promises of opportunity that masked kidnapping and servitude. Universities began funding research projects. Genealogists offered their services pro bono to help identify children in photographs. The National Archives committed resources to digitizing and cross-referencing documents that might reveal more cases. Rachel stood in the exhibition hall on opening night, watching visitors examine the portrait. Many stopped at Sarah's face, reading the detailed placard that told her story. Some cried openly. Others stood in angry silence, fists clenched. All left with a new understanding of how slavery's legacy had persisted long after the 13th Amendment, hidden in plain sight in photographs that seemed to show nothing more than wealthy families and their comfortable, respectable lives. A young black woman approached Rachel, her eyes red from crying. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for making them visible, for giving them names. My own family has stories like this, children who disappeared, who we never found. Seeing Sarah's face, knowing someone cared enough to investigate, to tell the truth, it matters. It matters so much." The portrait that had seemed so innocent, a prosperous family posing formally, two children playing harmlessly in the background, had revealed a truth that refused to stay buried. Sarah Wallace would never be forgotten again. Her face, her name, her suffering, and her resistance would be remembered. And somewhere, in archives and attics across America, other photographs waited. Other invisible children, dressed in fine clothes to mask their captivity, wearing restraint marks hidden just out of focus, their stories waiting to be uncovered. Other names waiting to be spoken, other families waiting to finally know what happened to the children who were taken and never came home. The work of remembering had only just begun,